the intensification of energy use is how we've escaped a sort of subsistence type existence. The Industrial Revolution is about energy, primarily coal, at that stage. And when I put my foundation hat on and look at, okay, what needs to be done for Africa, poor countries in general, but particularly Africa, the amount of electricity per person has gone down in Africa over the last 20 years. And there's no way you can build, there's an upper bound on what you can do with an economy unless you get infrastructure, including roads and electricity, up to a certain level. So it's a huge concern that all these developmental goals we have are unachievable unless you get energy available there. And then you combine that with the fact that the people who are the most going to suffer from the built-in warming that is unavoidable and from the additional warming that is avoidable that we won't avoid, those are subsistence farmers in Africa. They're going from having 1 out of 12 years where their harvest fails, they will get to the point where it's 1 out of 4 years. And that leads to, severe malnutrition, starvation, at a time when the population growth, soil quality, many factors are working against you. So I'm not just a believer in taking the 9% of your income that Americans spend on energy and saying, okay, let's just pay a premium to feel like we're clean people, but rather you've got to solve this problem for China, India, and Africa without making energy super expensive. So that, that constraint makes what's already an almost impossible problem even slightly more difficult. When people come to me and say, hey, the world is going to fall into a state of disaster, this is a huge problem, it's unsolvable, my view is, well, maybe they're underestimating the power of innovation to come along and change and improve things. And so in the 90s, and I was reading about climate change, and then after 2000, where Ken Caldera, David Keith, a few people, I started having them on a regular basis to educate me and telling me what to read about climate change. The thing that blew my mind was that people would talk about these downstream taxes and subsidies, but there was no discussion about upstream incentives, no discussion about increasing the energy R&D budget. The U.S. energy R&D budget it was reduced by Reagan. Carter had driven it up and Reagan drove it down, and it stayed down. And all these climate people, they never talk about the research budget. I think it's partly a confusion about the nature of the problem. What it means that electricity is only 25% of the problem, and you need reliable electricity. And the goal is not to take a bow because you use natural gas and you got a factor of 2. That's nothing. That contributes 0. In fact, because the forcing function is sooner on natural gas, completing coal to natural gas right now in the next 50 years and then shutting it down, that's a net addition. It's just that you're doing your math wrong because you don't understand the way the lifetime trade-offs are done for natural gas anyway. So the idea that R&D wasn't like the prime thing, and I remember sitting with Obama, there were a bunch of us there, I'd created this coalition, and I was saying, hey, if you can only do one thing, increase the R&D budget, and he said, no, I can do the carbon tax and the R&D budget. Well, we ended up getting nothing at all, even though the R&D piece, which is a long lead time piece, which is very necessary, probably could have been done. So in any case, as part of the Paris Climate Accord, I'd gone to 30 different countries and said, will you come and commit to double your energy R&D budget? And in fact, the only reason Modi came to the event was because he was enthused about that. We picked his name for it, which was called Mission Innovation. And there was this big announcement there. And in fact, most of the countries that announced have followed through. The US is slightly off a straight doubling, but in total, an extra $3 billion now has gone into R&D since that event, which does tilt the odds slightly in the favor of the breakthroughs that we need. Now, we also need the basic research budget is only an enabling thing. You need the next step after that, but it is certainly critical and was not on the agenda. Gates Foundation funds a thing called improving photosynthetic efficiency, and there is literally a factor of 2 to be had in terms of changing the basic photosynthetic pathway. There's about 4 different things you have to do, but the photosynthetic pathway is not optimized. That is, there was an evolutionary bottleneck when CO2 levels were very low, and these plants don't have the right rubisco and the right, they turn off, they don't like to die, and so they're not maximizers in terms of their output. And so there's various ways that you can change photosynthesis. That would be extremely valuable, not just in the plant economy, but also as you move that over into trees. That's right. That are extremely good. They sequester carbon extremely well. That's a large standing stock of carbon, although it's a one-time gain unless you do some put it down below the ground. Eventually it'll rot and recycle back in. So yes, and I think it's like improving photosynthetic efficiency, not funded. What could be cooler than improving photosynthetic efficiency? Yeah, so nuclear starts out per reaction with 1 million times advantage over burning hydrocarbons. So you'd think, hey, a factor of 1 million, we must be able to preserve at least some of that and not be absurdly expensive. In fact, in the US, nuclear is not even close to being competitive. It's probably a factor of 4 or 5 non-competitive. The key parameters in a nuclear build are how long it takes to build, what your interest rate of your money is, and maybe some uncertainty factor of whether you get stopped or not. And so in China, those numbers are basically 3 to 4 years and 2%. Whereas in the US, there may be 8 to 9 years, 15%, and maybe 50% chance you'll get shut down before you get started. So when you're competing with super cheap natural gas, there's no way. Also, current designs are, although per output it's the safest form of energy ever created, more than, say, natural gas lines that blow up in neighborhoods or coal mines that create particulate that's not good for health. Because it happens in Chernobyl-like events, it's unfortunate. Those designs that have high pressure and they don't have a good heat pool and they require operators to actually look at lights and do things, it's a pathetic design. And yet it hasn't been changed. It hasn't been redone in the digital age where we can massively simplify it, make sure there's no pressure anywhere, which forces you to, in our case, a sodium pool design. So it's on paper, which is where it exists in this incredible simulation. This thing is phenomenal, incredible. An end of so-called 4th generation nuclear. It's the only well-funded project. Even so, it requires the US and China to work together. How's that going? It requires a lot of patient capital, but nuclear in China is cheaper than coal. We need US and China to work together to bring this solution, because the US understanding of these issues is phenomenal. We shut down FFTF, but there was a lot of materials learning there that was quite fantastic. And the Chinese are where they're going to build a lot of reactors, really build them. I mean, they'll show you the sites. They're quite serious about it. So if nuclear has a chance, that's probably it. We just did a deal with the European Union where they put money in to fund startups, literally European Union money. And it's because they're worried that if they raise the research money, there won't be investors coming to Europe and finding the really good work there. And so it was a sort of quid pro quo. We never could have gotten that mission innovation R&D increase if we hadn't said that there will be a venture fund that will take the best work and carry it forward, ideally all the way into a product. So being a voice of, okay, what are the regulatory barriers to these startup companies? What type what types of tax credits and approach are very helpful? Today it's mostly the learning curve for solar and wind, which, is that really compared to other technologies that have this weird thing of working 24 hours a day? Should you really be funding the intermittent stuff with all the money and putting no money in the stuff that works all the time? And so the tax policies, you got to think Japan or Germany and the US for bootstrapping the solar panel industry, which is today largely a Chinese industry. Well, the globe is a big place. You have 194 countries. I'm involved in eradicating polio. So I deal with northern Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, Afghanistan. I know where in Kandahar we still have polio. So if you say global, that brings up an image to me that, okay, you're not going to get every country in this thing. And it is interesting that of all the tough problems, stopping pandemics, solving climate change, they are cooperation problems, that no one country alone can do that. I'm hopeful that you can get most of the rich countries involved in that. I think it's a very helpful thing to send that price signal. It's not Pigovian in the sense that it substitutes for the damage. It's not at all. It's simply a price signal that incents some risk-taking behavior, but not the classic Pigovian, hey, pay the price, okay. That's what the burden to society was. It's not within a factor of 100 of what that is as you project out into the future. Certainly for things like carbon capture and sequestration, because there's not a view that will ever be positive economics. You've got to have that, and that probably is a necessary thing. And you have to have a sense that it'll be there over a long period of time. I do think, some things that I think will come back. I think the U.S. will re-enter the Paris Climate Accord, but take Germany, who's very well-meaning. They managed to make their consumers pay the highest electricity prices in the world. Their net carbon reduction is less than 10%. And so the world has not had a year where we make less CO2, and that will be an interesting year if it's not because of a massive recession. Yeah, one thing that really is irritating to me is when people think, oh, let's just get Africa to use clean energy. Get them. They are a rounding error of emissions. If they need to build hydro dams, let them build those dams. And yes, the reservoir causes methane emissions. It's fairly big numbers. But Africa should not be constrained. They should do whatever it takes to reduce malnutrition and starvation. And so people get confused. They think, oh, let's let them have little lights at night. Well, you don't create any jobs. The amount of electricity required to create a job, that is not intermittent electricity.